Hi everyone! So today we're going to start talking about the exposure controls of a camera. That's aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Let's get to it. Okay, so first off, why does learning these settings even matter? Well, everyone has a camera in their pocket, right? But the thing is that most of the time we're shooting on an automatic mode, which means the computer inside of your phone, your digital camera, whatever it is making creative decisions for you. So by learning these settings, you'll be able to communicate your creative vision instead of the computer making the decisions for you. Now, this is super helpful because from cameras that we're using, film cameras, to the latest cameras, these settings are used in every camera. So although, digital cameras and higher end cameras have extra settings and such, they still have the basic aperture, shutter speed, and ISO settings, which means that you can switch that camera to manual mode and use it. Okay, I'm not saying that those other settings aren't helpful for other types of photography and specific things. They are. But like I said, once you learn these three settings, you can use any camera out there. Okay, so first, before I really delve in, we're going to look at some examples so you have a visual reference of what we're talking about. And you are going to be introduced to some new vocabulary and some new ideas, and most people don't get it the very first time, okay? And it's okay. I'm going to go over this over and over with you guys, and we're going to be doing projects so that this really gets cemented into your head. Now, with this, if you keep practicing, you will learn all of these settings like the back of your hand. So let's look at some photos, and some important things to think about are, when we look at these photos, I want you guys to think about what the difference is between the two photos I'm showing you. Does the subject stand out more in this particular example? And last but not least, which do you like better and why? Now, this is important because being able to think a little bit more deeply about our photos and what we like and why we like them helps you really start getting your style down, your aesthetic. So let's look. Okay, so we have these two photos. Now, what do you notice? What is the big difference between these two? Okay, so if you said the background, you are correct. On this photo, we can see kind of what's going on in the background. We see that there's some trees back here, there's a waterfall. Now in this photo, all of that is completely blurred out. Now, which one do you like better? Now, for me, it really depends on what we're trying to communicate with the image. If I wanted to communicate that I am out in the woods by this waterfall, then I want it to be somewhat visible. But if this photo is really just about a portrait of myself, then the background isn't as important, and this would be the photo I would pick. Okay, so this big difference is caused by aperture. Aperture is going to affect how much of a scene is in focus. Okay, the next two photos. Again, what's the difference between the two? Do they feel different? And which do you like better and why? All right, so let's take a look. Now, what's the big difference between these two photos? Well, if you noticed, the water looks dramatically different. So in this photo, we have this really flowy type of look, whereas in this photo, the water is frozen in time. So what does this make you feel? For me, this one feels really calming, while this photo is really more about like the forcefulness of nature, the forcefulness of water. So this big difference between these two is caused by shutter speed. Shutter speed helps us control how motion is represented in a photograph. Okay, next example. Again, what's the difference? Do they feel different? Which do you like better and why? Okay, so what's the big difference? Now with this photo, it's nice and clear and sharp, Everything is really smooth, whereas in this photo we have all of these little dots going around and there's not as much sharpness going on. So this photo has grain, is what we would call it with film, or noise is what we call it with digital. And this is caused by a difference in ISO. Or also, you can think of it as how sensitive the film is. So all three of these settings are exposure settings. Besides what I just showed you, how they affect how it looks like, these also control how light or dark a photo is. So we can also speak with exposure. Now there's a proper exposure, whereas you're getting all the detail in the lightest areas of an image and all the detail in the darkest areas of an image, but how light and dark you create a photo also affects the communication. So let's look at these two photos. And these are two photos taken with two different exposure settings. One of them is obviously a lot lighter and one of them's a lot darker. What does this make you feel? The lighter one for me makes me feel a little bit more hopeful, while the darker one feels a little bit more doomsday or something dramatic is happening. Okay, so let's take a closer look at these settings. All right, so aperture. Aperture is the opening of a lens. So I've got my trusty Pentax K1000 here. It's one of the first cameras that I owned, and I'm going to show you. So let's get really close up in here, and you can see, well, hold on. All right, hold on. Let me pause real quick. Okay, so here we go. You can see there's a little opening in the lens. Now, if I change the aperture, that opening, oops, there we go, gets larger. You can see that it's, it's showing back there. So we can control how large or how small this opening is, and this is aperture. Okay, let me get this back on my camera real quick. There we go. Continuing on. So this controls the depth of field, or how much of a photo, how much of a scene can be in focus. This is also controlling how much light is coming through the lens. The aperture setting is also called f-stop. So if you've ever heard people say, I'm using f-stop 5.6 or f-stop 22 or f22, that means they're talking about aperture. Now, larger openings have a smaller f-stop number. This is because it's actually a fraction. So when I'm saying f2, let's say, I'm really saying f1 over 2. But to simplify it, and also because we use fractions when we're talking about shutter speed, we drop the top part and we're just talking about the bottom, the denominator, f2. So at first it can be a little bit confusing, but with practice, like I said, it's going to become second nature for you. So larger openings have a smaller f-stop number, while the smaller openings have a larger f-stop numbers. So f16 and f22 is a smaller opening, while f1.8, f2, f4, those are larger openings. So depth of field. Let's talk about depth of field a little bit more. Like I said, it's the distance between the nearest and furthest objects that can be in focus in a camera. It's how much of a scene can be in focus. So if we have a narrow depth of field, only a small area will be in focus. But if we have a large depth of field or a deep depth of field, now more of this area will be in focus. So you've seen the photographer's position hasn't changed, but in this case their aperture has changed. In this case they have a large aperture like f2, and that's leaving only a narrow depth of field. So in this case, if we could see this photo, the animal would be in focus and the background would be completely blurred out. Now in this case, they would have a small aperture like f22, and we would have a large depth of field. So if we could see this photo, the animal would be in focus, the trees would be in focus, we could see the mountains a bit clearly. So that's a huge difference, right? Now, if you're really interested in learning a little bit more about depth of field, or if it's not quite clicking, I've included a link down here to an optional blog post that explains it with even more photos. So you're welcome to check that out. Okay, so again, a larger opening creates less depth of field. And you can maybe hear this referred to as a small depth of field, shallow depth of field, narrow depth of field, while as a smaller opening creates more depth of field. And you may hear this referred to as a large or deep depth of field. We're going to be doing a whole project where you do this so it really starts to become ingrained. Now, I also have this chart here that puts all this information together. So you can see f1.4, that's a small number. It's a large opening, and we have a small depth of field. So it might be easier, it all depends. We all think a little bit differently, but it might be easier for your brain to think of, the small number, small depth of field. That works. And then you can see as we go, as the opening gets smaller and smaller, the number gets bigger and the depth of field gets bigger. Okay. So in this case, F32, we have a much deeper depth of field, a larger depth of field. And you're more than welcome to, there's all kinds of charts like this online. You can download on your phone. You can take a screenshot of this if you want, keep it on your phone when you're out shooting to help you remember. Now, Aperture also controls how much light is coming through the lens. So a small aperture is going to let in less light, and a large aperture is going to let in more light. So let me do this quick demonstration to show you guys what I'm talking about. And there's a link here to this tool. It's called Camera Sim. It's really fun. If you want to come here and play around with these settings before you start shooting on film, you're more than welcome to. Okay, so let's get into it. Okay, so right now, let's see, set this here. So right here I have this scene, and but looking through this real quick, you could change the lighting here from sunny to darker. Let's leave it there. You can change your distance from the subject. You can change the focal length, which is different types of lenses. We're going to get into that later in the semester. And there's also different modes. Now for this, I definitely want to be on manual mode. That's what we're going to be shooting on. That's basically the only setting we have on the cameras we're using. We have the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed. So right now, the settings are set up so that if I took a photo, we have a good exposure. Okay, looks good, right? Now, if I only change the aperture, let's say I go to f22, okay, I have just gone to a small aperture, which means I'm letting less light in. If I'm letting less light in, can you guys guess what's going to happen when I take a photo? If you said that the photo is going to be darker, you are correct. We're letting less light in. So let's take a photo. Oh, and look, it looks pretty dark, right? Let's go back. And so on the other side, if I took this to the largest aperture possible, so on here it's f2.8, I'm letting way more light in, which means my photo is going to be too bright. Okay, let's see. Way too bright. All right. So aperture is controlling how much light is coming in and out of the lens. Or not out, but just coming in through the lens. Now, down here's another chart I've included that combines all this information in another way. Again, you can save this if you want. So here we have f1.4 with a shallow depth of field. So we're showing a shallow depth of field. And so this little graphic shows us that the flowers would just be in focus. Here we have kind of a middle, getting into the middle depths of field where we have more in focus. So here's the depth of field. We have the flowers and the bear. And then finally, a small aperture means that we're going to have more depth of field. And so there's going to be more in focus. So we have the little bear, the flowers, and the mountains all nice in focus. All right, so now let's talk about shutter speed. All right, so shutter speed, or sometimes it's also called exposure time. Let me move this over so if you guys are taking notes. Okay, exposure time is how long the shutter in a camera is open. So let me show you on my camera here. Now, I don't recommend that you have a camera out like this. You don't want to get a lot of dust and stuff inside. This is a pretty old camera. It's already got some issues, so no worries. But here we go. So first off, I'm going to set this, using my shutter dial, I'm going to set this to 1,000th of a second. On the dial, it just says 1,000. And you're going to see that when I hit the shutter, the mirror is going to pop up. Oh no, do I have film in here? I might. Well, here. Oh, my meter's broken anyways. Well, oh well, if there is film in there. Anyways, okay, so did you see that? I don't think there's film in there. Again, it's gonna go fast, 1/1000th of a second. All right, now let me go to a really slow shutter speed. I'm gonna go to 1 second. Now this time you're probably going to be able to see it a little bit easier. Okay, there's no film in there. I didn't see any film back there. So you can see that it went up for a whole second and then went back down. There's also on these cameras what's called bulb. Most film cameras like this though. It's marked by a B, and that means that when you hit the button, the mirror pops up and your exposure starts, and it's not going to pop back down until you let the button go. So if you need to go a really long exposure, this is what you do, and you kind of have to count it out. So I'm going to hit it. Oops. And you can see the mirror is popped up and is staying up. And when I let go of the shutter release button, it pops back down. Sweet. So that's the shutter. That's what's going on back there. All right. Now, shutter speed, again, is how we control how motion is captured in our images. So the big question is, if there's something moving in your image, do you want to show the motion with a slow shutter speed, or do you want to freeze the motion with a fast shutter speed? So in this example back here, you can see that the person is blurry. Now the building isn't moving, there's no motion going on in the building, so that's going to be nice and clear. But if there's anything moving like this person, if you have a slower shutter speed, we're going to see the motion. We're going to see the motion blur with this. Now this is also controlling how long light is hitting the film. Okay, or the sensor if we're talking about digital. So this is also going to be helping control the amount of light along with the lens. Now shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second. So if my shutter speed is 1/60, or on these cameras it says, let me get my lens back on here. What's going on here? Oh, there we go. Okay. Anyways, so at the top here we have the dial. Oh, that's right. Sorry, everything's backwards for me right here. So again, if I'm moving this, let's say if I'm moving it to 1/60th of a second. Okay, you can see the little red arrow is pointing to the 60 now. So that means I'm at 1/60th of a second. Now, shutter speed can be longer in low light situations, like at night, and sometimes there's such low light, and depending on your other settings, you can have shutter speeds that are minutes, hours. There's people that have even experimented and done days-long shutter speeds. Now, like I said, a fast shutter speed will freeze motion. Some examples are 1,000th of a second, 1/2000th of a second, 1/4000th of a second. Most film cameras, at least the SLRs we're using, are going to go up to 1/1000th of a second. A slow shutter speed is going to show motion. Some examples are 1/15th of a second, 1 second, 30 seconds. Now, what is considered fast or slow? Like, these are some, some general ideas. These are like, at the very ends of the spectrum. But what's considered fast or slow depends on how fast the motion is. If you're photographing a race car, something like 1,000th of a second, you might still get blurred if that's going super fast. But, if you're photographing something that's moving super slow, it might, 1/500th of a second would be just fine. Maybe 1/200th of a second would be just fine. To show the motion of something really slow, you would probably have to go super slow on your shutter speed. So it all depends on how fast the movement of your subject is. And now in general, and this kind of changes, it depends on the person, it depends on the diagram, but you usually want to use a tripod if your shutter speed is slower than 1/125th of a second, which on our case, that would be 1/60th of a second on the cameras we're using. So yeah, if you want to take anything slower than that, you want to be on a tripod so that you're not moving, so your camera doesn't actually move, because any little movement could show up in the photo. Okay. So, continuing on. Now, again, shutter speed determines how motion is captured. You can freeze motion with the fast shutter speed, okay, frozen in time, or you can show motion with a slow shutter speed. So this is something that you might want to screenshot just as a quick visual reference. Fast shutter freezes, slow shutter shows. And here again, we have another chart that kind of helps you out. You could see this is the 1 second. So we have this double little mark here that means seconds. So 1 second, you're going to be showing the motion, and it's going to allow more light in. You're going to need a tripod if you're getting slower here. Over here, we have, we're letting less light in. We're freezing the action, and you don't need a tripod, usually. There's also lens links that come into it, but we're going to get into that later. Okay, so let's go back to Camera Sim and take a look. So I'm going to set this back to even exposure was at f11. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you an example of a slow shutter speed and a fast shutter speed. Now again, right now we have an even exposure, so if I take a photo, it looks great. Now if I take my shutter speed all the way over, 1/4000th of a second, so now I have a really fast shutter speed. So what do you think this is going to do to the photo? Okay, so if you said that it's going to freeze the motion, yes, it's going to freeze the motion, but I'm also letting less light in, so it's also going to make for a darker photo. Oh my God, it was so fast that hardly any light came in. Now, let me go ahead and change something here. We're going to get into this even more on the next lecture, but so if I am not letting in enough light to get a photo, I need to let in light in another way, which is going to be with my aperture. So I'm going to open up my aperture, and it's not quite even yet. We'll go here. That's 1/1000th of a second. That's still pretty fast. So let's take a photo now. Okay, so we have a good exposure, and the motion is frozen. Frozen because we have a fast shutter speed. Now let's go with a really slow shutter speed. Let's go all the way down. And so right now I'm at 1 second. That's a really slow shutter speed. And I'm going to go ahead and because I have a slow shutter speed, I'm letting in a whole bunch of light right now. So I need to let in less light by changing my aperture. Okay. And I'm still letting in too much light. All right, we'll get a little bit of motion blur with these settings. So I'm at 1/15th of a second, f22. All right, so you can see that I have a good exposure, but my subject is moving and we can see the motion. The other problem is you can see the background is not in focus. There is camera shake happening there. That should still be in focus. So the big issue would be to go and put my camera on a tripod. And now the background's in focus because we're on a tripod, but we're still capturing the motion of the girl and the little pinwheel moving back and forth. Okay. Next, let's talk about ISO. Move myself over here. ISO or ASA or film speed. So ISO is how sensitive film or the sensor for digital is to light. Now, I also say ASA because on some cameras, that's what they used to be called. So some of the older cameras still say ASA on them. On cameras and light meters, we're going to talk about light meters later. So a small number like ISO means that this film is less sensitive to light. Now, that means it's going to need more light to create an image. But this also means that you're going to have less grain or less noise. So if you remember on that first example of the telephone booth, the one that was nice and clear, that was a small ISO. That was at ISO 100. So you're going to get the finest detail and less grain and noise when you're using a smaller ISO. When you're using a larger number like ISO 1600, 3200, you are getting a sensor or film that is more sensitive to light, so you need less light to create an image, but then you do get that grain or that noise going on in your images. So a lot of times we have no choice when it comes to really dark scenes where there's also action. A great example of this that we're going to look at is concert photography, where it's dark, the surroundings are dark, but you want to make sure that you're freezing the motion, and so we end up using a higher ISO film or changing the ISO setting on a digital camera. Okay. Now, because of all this, like I said, concert photography, the high grain look is commonly associated with photos of musicians because of this exact reason. There was no choice but to use very high ISO, especially before digital, between like the 50s to the 90s. Pretty much every concert photo has that high ISO grainy look. A lot of people would try not to do that. But now it's become its own thing. Now there's filters where you can do it. So there's some subjects that are great for this. Some people choose high ISO for the aesthetic, for like grungy or urban or musicians. So let's look. Here's a couple examples. Okay. So here we have some examples from rockarchive.com, and with this we also have these awesome lines going on. Now, what do you think those lines are caused by? What other setting is going on? If you said shutter speed, you're correct. They used a slower shutter speed, and it caught the motion. It's showing the motion of the trumpet being moved. Now here's another one. You could see the grain. You can see all of these little dots in here. This is a high grain image of Bowie, but it has a look to it, right? And last but not least, now this is a high grain image and it was cropped in. You can see how big the grains are. Beautiful image. Okay, so here is an example, and this was taken on digital, not film, but it's still a good example. So I went out to the OAB and I took photos of the OAB with different ISOs. And there's not that much of a change going here, but then when we get over here, we're starting to see a huge difference, right? So I took, this image I took and I spliced it and put it together. And now in this next thing, I basically took the corner of each image and put them all together so we can really see side by side. So you can see here we have ISO 100 spanning all the way to 25,600. Now with film photography, you can usually find film that's 100, 400, 1600, and 3200. You can really see the difference here. And not only is it you getting grain when it comes to digital, you're also getting some changes in the colors, these weird purpley and bluey things happening. So you can definitely see ISO 100 next to 25,600. It's a huge difference. And like I said, this is the same area of sky that I put next to each other. Crazy, right? All right. If you wanted to look at some more images from Rock Archive, there's a link here. But anyways, so that is the basics of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. In the next lecture, I'm going to talk about how they all work together to create a good exposure and how you can tell when you're getting a great exposure.